Imagine standing in a muddy field on October 25th, 1415, watching what should have been the end of English history. 6,000 English soldiers, sick, starving, and literally half naked, stood face to face with the greatest military force in Europe. 30,000 French knights in gleaming armor stretched across the horizon like a metallic ocean of death, ready to wash away this pitiful English army forever. But this story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins with a young man who never wanted to be king. Henry V was 29 years old when he inherited a kingdom that was falling apart at the seams. His father had seized the throne through violence, and now rebellions were tearing England apart. The treasury was empty, the nobles were plotting, and Henry's legitimacy was questioned daily. Every morning he woke up wondering if this would be the day another noble challenged his right to rule. That's when Henry made a decision that would either save his kingdom or destroy it completely. He would unite England through war with France. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity: claim the French throne, win a few quick victories, and return home a hero. In August 1415, Henry landed at Harfleur with 12,000 of England's finest soldiers. Victory seemed inevitable, but Harfleur had other plans. What should have been a quick victory turned into a nightmare that would haunt Henry for the rest of his short life. For 5 grueling weeks, Henry watched his grand invasion turn into a medical disaster as dysentery ravaged his army. Desperate and humiliated, Henry sent a formal challenge to the French prince, a one-on-one duel to settle everything like knights of old. The French prince's response was perhaps the most insulting thing that had ever happened to an English king: complete and utter silence. When Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's victory felt like a defeat. Half his army was dead or dying. Any sane king would have sailed home. But Henry wasn't thinking sanely anymore. His pride had been wounded, and wounded pride makes men do impossible things. He made a decision that his advisors thought was complete madness. Henry would march his sick army across 200 miles of enemy territory to reach Calais. He sent his sickest men home and left a garrison at Harfleur. His army was now reduced to just 6,000 men. Most of them were archers, not knights. They had no heavy cavalry, no siege weapons, and no hope of reinforcements. On October 8th, this pitifully small army began what would become one of the most famous marches in military history, though nobody knew it at the time. But Henry wasn't marching alone through France. In the shadows, an enormous French army was stalking his every move. The French commanders were master strategists. They realized Henry was heading for the River Somme and moved quickly to cut off his escape route. They systematically destroyed every bridge across the Somme. Henry's army was being herded like sheep toward a slaughter that the French had carefully planned. When Henry reached the Somme, his worst fears were realized. Every crossing was blocked, and French forces were closing in from all sides. For weeks they marched south along the river, desperately searching for a crossing, while their food supplies dwindled to nothing. After 20 miles of marching, they finally found a ford. But crossing meant entering the heart of enemy territory with no way back. As the English army emerged from the icy water, they thought the worst was behind them. They were tragically wrong. Just when Henry thought he was in the clear, the French army began to materialize in front of him, like a nightmare coming to life. One by one, an endless stream of mounted knights rode out and formed battle lines. The sight was so overwhelming that English soldiers began to pray. Henry's men were a pathetic sight: dirty, tired, sick, and starving. Many of his archers had removed their pants entirely due to dysentery. They looked like a mob of medieval beggars facing the greatest military force in Europe. The odds were at least 5-1 against them. An English soldier looked out at the massive French army and began to panic, shouting about how badly they were outnumbered and how they were all going to die. That's when Henry did something that transformed him from a desperate king into a legend. He gave a speech that would echo through history. "I would not, even if I could, have a single man more than I do," Henry declared, his voice carrying across the battlefield with absolute conviction. "Do you not believe that the Almighty, with his humble few, is able to overcome the arrogance of the French who boast of their great numbers?" He swore to his men that he would accept no ransom for his life. If they fell, he would die with them as their king. The words of their king steeled the English soldiers. They had come this far together, and they would face death together as brothers. Henry quickly called for his priests to hear the final confessions of all his men. If they were going to die, they would die with clean souls. As the last soldier crossed himself and stood, both armies faced each other in deathly silence. Neither side wanted to make the first move, as Henry expertly maneuvered his small force to match French movements. The minutes stretched into hours. Then darkness began to fall. The French began to retreat to nearby villages while Henry's exhausted men had no choice but to remain in the open field under the cold night sky. Suddenly, the sky opened up and freezing rain began to fall. Henry and his men were quickly soaked to the bone. They huddled under trees, listening to the sounds of French celebration carried on the wind while they shivered in the darkness. Henry ordered complete silence. Anyone who made a sound would have their ear cut off. As his men tried to sleep, the king stayed awake planning the impossible. As dawn broke on October 25th, 1415, Henry put on his helmet with its golden crown. He would not hide in the coming battle. Like a lighthouse in the dark morning, the sun's rays danced on his shining crown. Every man on the battlefield would know where their king stood. Henry had spent the night studying the battlefield, and now he led his army to the perfect position, a narrow field where the forest would funnel the French charge. He positioned his men-at-arms in a thin line in the center and placed his archers on the flanks, protected by wooden stakes. Throughout their march, Henry had forced his archers to carry these wooden stakes. Now the reason became crystal clear: cavalry protection. Henry also sent 200 of his best archers to hide in the woods flanking the battlefield. The French would face arrows from 3 directions. Meanwhile, the French were making a crucial mistake that would cost them everything. Their nobles wanted glory, not victory. Every French noble wanted to be in the front line where they could win personal glory by killing the English king themselves. This meant that France's most experienced commanders would be fighting as common soldiers, while inexperienced nobles led from behind. The French also made a fatal tactical error. They decided to fight on foot, abandoning their greatest advantage: heavy cavalry. They believed their superior numbers and heavier armor would crush the English in close combat, but they were about to learn a terrible lesson. As the French army formed up for battle, they created a formation that was tactically disastrous. A massive crowd of armored men packed together like sardines. For 3 hours, both armies stared at each other across the muddy field. Neither side wanted to make the first move. Henry realized that waiting favored the French. More enemy reinforcements were arriving every hour, and his men were growing weaker. Finally, Henry made the decision that would echo through history. He ordered his army to advance within bowshot range of the French lines. The English archers pulled up their protective stakes, advanced to a new position, and drove them back into the ground. Now within range, Henry gave the order that would change everything. "Loose," he shouted, and 6,000 arrows darkened the sky. The French response was immediate and catastrophic. Instead of maintaining discipline, they charged forward in a disorganized mob, desperate to escape the arrow storm. The muddy field became their enemy. Knights in 100-pound armor began sinking into the soft ground with every step. As the French struggled through the mud, wave after wave of English arrows rained down on them with deadly accuracy. The English archers were not just peasants with bows. They were professional soldiers who had trained from childhood, capable of shooting 12 arrows per minute with devastating accuracy. French knights who reached the English lines were exhausted, disorganized, and easy targets for English men-at-arms with hammers and daggers. The battle became a slaughter. French nobles who had dreamed of glory found themselves drowning in mud, unable to move or fight effectively. In just 30 minutes, the most powerful army in Europe was completely destroyed. The flower of French nobility lay dead in a muddy field. When the fighting ended, the English could barely believe what they had accomplished. They had achieved the impossible. The Casualties told the story of the most one-sided battle in medieval history. France lost over 6,000 nobles, including 3 dukes and dozens of counts. English losses were almost unbelievable, fewer than 30 men killed. Henry's impossible gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. Henry ordered his men to give thanks to God, not to celebrate their own prowess. He knew this victory was beyond human achievement. The Battle of Agincourt became legend immediately. Word of the impossible victory spread across Europe like wildfire. But the real significance of Agincourt wasn't just military. It was the birth of a New England united under a king who had proven himself worthy of the crown. Agincourt proved that in the right circumstances, the impossible becomes inevitable. Sometimes the underdog wins through courage, strategy, and sheer determination. The battle changed the nature of medieval warfare forever. Heavy cavalry would never again dominate battlefields as they had for centuries. More importantly, it showed that common soldiers, archers, farmers, and craftsmen could defeat the greatest nobles in Europe when properly led and motivated. Henry V died young, just 7 years after Agincourt, but his legend lived on. He had transformed from a doubtful king into an icon of English courage. Today, Agincourt reminds us that leadership isn't about having the best equipment or the largest army. It's about having the courage to face impossible odds. The next time you face overwhelming challenges, remember 6,000 sick English soldiers who refused to surrender when 30,000 French knights told them they had no chance.